In the summer of 1940, German tanks crushed France in 6 weeks. The largest standing army in Europe collapsed before the Blitzkrieg faster than any officer in Washington had dared to predict. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, privately told President Roosevelt that if Germany landed 5 divisions on the East Coast, the American military had nothing to stop them. The reason was simple. In 1939, the entire United States produced 18 medium tanks. By June 1940, the entire U.S. Army owned 66 medium tanks, fewer than Germany had lost in a single week of fighting in France. Roosevelt needed someone who could turn the largest civilian industry on Earth into a war machine. He asked his advisor, Bernard Baruch, to name the top 3 candidates. First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. William Knudsen was the president of General Motors, the largest corporation in the world. He was a Danish immigrant who had started in a shipyard with $30 in his pocket and climbed to the top of the American auto industry on one thing alone. He understood how to mass-produce complex things faster than anyone else alive. Knudsen gave up his $300,000 a year salary at GM to accept $1 a year from the government. When his family sat stunned in the living room of their Detroit home, one of his children asked why he was doing it. "This country has been good to me, I want to pay it back." But Knudsen knew he could not build a tank factory by himself. He needed people who knew how to assemble machines weighing dozens of tons from thousands of components on a production line, and do it fast. Only one industry in America knew how: the Detroit auto industry. The only problem: no one in the auto industry had ever seen a tank, let alone built one. In June 1940, Knudsen picked up the phone and called Keller, the president of Chrysler Corporation, America's second-largest automaker, a company that stamped car frames and cast automobile engines for a living. Knudsen asked him directly, "Could Chrysler build tanks?" "Yes." "Where can I see one?" Keller had never seen a tank in his life, but he had just agreed to mass-produce a 30-ton war machine he had never laid eyes on, for an army that owned 66 of them, in a factory that did not yet exist, from a design that was not yet finished, against the tank force that had just crushed Europe. And what happened next, in the 8 months after that phone call, would prove Göring, Hitler, and every logistics textbook on Earth wrong at the same time. But not in any way that Keller himself, or anyone else, could have imagined. While Knudsen and Keller were staring at a tank they had never built 3,000 miles east, the men who had built the most feared tank force on Earth were staring at America and laughing. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, a World War I fighter ace who had built the Luftwaffe from nothing into the dominant air force in Europe. He delivered his assessment of American industrial capability with a decade of German engineering supremacy behind every word. "The Americans are good about making fancy cars and refrigerators, but that doesn't mean they're any good at making aircraft. They are bluffing. They're excellent at bluffing." Göring had reason to believe it. In 1940, the United States had no significant arms industry. Germany had been mass-producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery for the better part of a decade. The Wehrmacht had just destroyed the largest army in Western Europe in 42 days. American factories were stamping out Chrysler Imperials and Chevrolet sedans. Adolf Hitler shared Göring's contempt and added his own. Around 1940, he offered his evaluation of the nation that would soon become his most dangerous adversary. "What is America but beauty queens, millionaires, stupid records, and Hollywood?" In private, recorded by his armaments minister Albert Speer, Hitler elaborated, "The Americans were not a real nation, just a disorganized mass of immigrants from dozens of countries and races. They had contributed little in the last war. They would not withstand a trial by fire. Their fighting qualities were low, and here is the part that matters. Hitler was not entirely wrong about the present. In June 1940, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world in size, behind Portugal. Its tank inventory would not have lasted a single day against a German Panzer division. The country that would need to produce tens of thousands of tanks to fight this war did not have a single factory capable of building one. But what Göring and Hitler failed to understand What would take them 4 years and the destruction of the Third Reich to learn was simpler than either man could have accepted. They were not measuring the wrong thing about America, they were measuring the right thing and drawing the wrong conclusion. American factories were indeed building cars and refrigerators. That was precisely the point. Because the skills required to mass-produce a Chrysler sedan at the rate of hundreds per day were exactly the skills required to mass-produce a 30-ton tank. Detroit was about to stop making cars. 2 months after that phone call, Keller's engineers stood at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, staring at the M3 medium tank for the first time. It weighed 30 tons, roughly 10 times heavier than a Chrysler Imperial. Its 75mm gun was mounted in a sponson on the hull side and could only traverse 15 degrees. The design was not elegant, it was not even finished, but the Army needed 1,000 of them, and Chrysler had signed a $54.5 million contract to deliver. There was one problem. Chrysler did not have a factory. There was no facility in the United States designed to mass-produce tanks, so Chrysler would build one. In September 1940, construction began on 113 acres of farmland in Warren Township, just north of Detroit. Cows were still grazing on the adjacent fields when the first concrete was poured. The architect was Albert Kahn, who had already designed Ford's River Rouge plant, the largest industrial complex on Earth. He built the walls 3 feet thick in reinforced concrete because in the fall of 1940, no one knew how far the Germans would get and the plant had to survive aerial bombardment. When finished, the Detroit Arsenal tank plant would stretch 5 city blocks long and 2 blocks wide, housing 1,000 machine tools and over 8,000 specialized jigs and fixtures. It would employ 5,500 workers. But Chrysler did not wait for it to be finished. Through the Michigan winter of 1940 to 1941, the walls were still going up. Snow piled on open floors. Chrysler dragged a steam locomotive inside the unfinished building and fired it up, not to move anything, but to pump heat into a factory that did not yet have walls. A skeleton crew of fewer than 400 workers began assembling the first M3 Lee tanks in the middle of a construction site, surrounded by cranes, wet concrete, and open sky. On April the 24th, 1941, 8 months after the contract was signed, the first completed M3 Lee rolled off the line. The factory was still being built around it. The governor of Michigan came to watch a 30-ton steel machine fire its guns and smash through telephone poles and a small wooden house. The plant had been an empty field 7 months earlier, and then the pattern repeated. In November 1941, the government went to Fisher Body, a division of General Motors, the company that built Chevrolet sedans and Buick coupes, and asked them to do the same thing. Fisher broke ground on a 452,000 square foot tank arsenal in Grand Blanc, south of Flint. 2 months later, in January 1942, the first M4A2 Sherman rolled off the Fisher line. The factory was not finished. Workers who had been welding Chevrolet frames the year before were now welding Sherman hulls. Detroit's automakers did not wait for perfect conditions. They built tanks first and finished the factories later. But building the factory was only half the problem. The Sherman needed an engine, and there were not enough purpose-built tank engines in existence. Chrysler's solution was one of the strangest pieces of engineering in the entire war. They took 5 6-cylinder engines from Chrysler Royal and Windsor passenger cars, engines designed to cruise down Michigan highways at 40 miles an hour, and bolted them together in a star configuration to create a single 30-cylinder monster called the A57 Multibank. It sounded insane and looked even worse. It produced over 400 horsepower, and it worked. Chrysler was the only manufacturer in America that could build it. Chrysler even spent its own money developing something better. A water-cooled V12 called the A65, producing 549 horsepower. They installed it in a Sherman, ran 400 miles of tests and presented it to the Army. The Army turned it down. The reason had nothing to do with performance. The improved engine made the tank 10 inches longer, and 10 inches meant every shipping crate Every railcar fitting, every transport chain across two oceans had to be redesigned from scratch. Chrysler had built a better engine. The war did not want a better engine, it wanted the same engine by the thousands tomorrow. By mid-1942, the men who had run these assembly lines were leaving for the front. The people who replaced them had never set foot in a factory. Women entered the tank production lines in numbers that had no precedent in American industry. At Chrysler, the 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun, the weapon mounted on tanks and armored vehicles across every Allied theater, had originally taken 450 man-hours to build. By the end of the war, it took 10. Not because of new technology, because Detroit's production methods, refined over 3 decades of building automobiles, turned out to be the most transferable skill in the war. Walter Reuther, president of the United Auto Workers, would later put it in terms that stuck. Like England's battles were won on the playing fields of Eton, America's were won on the assembly lines of Detroit. In March 1942, Time magazine published a cover story that opened with a single observation. Something is happening that Adolf Hitler does not yet understand. A new reenactment of the old American miracle of wheels and machinery, but on a new scale. Time was wrong about one thing. Hitler understood perfectly well. In private, he had already calculated that Germany had a window, perhaps 4 years, before American industry reached full capacity. The war had to be won before that window closed. Across the Reich's economic planning offices, one question circulated with increasing urgency. Was marked Ford? What will Ford do? They were asking about the wrong company. It was not Ford that would bury them. It was Chrysler and General Motors, the car makers Hitler had dismissed as irrelevant. Here is what the comparison looked like by the end of 1942. Germany built its Tiger I tanks essentially by hand. Each one required thousands of man-hours of precision machining and fitting. Skilled workers assembled them individually, and no two were quite alike. Total Tiger I production across the entire war, 1,350. In December 1942 alone, the Chrysler Detroit Arsenal, a single factory on a single plot of former farmland in suburban Michigan, produced 907 Sherman tanks. One factory in 1 month had produced 2/3 of Germany's entire Tiger output for the whole war. The Germans did not need statistics to understand what was happening. They could see it. On the Italian front, Wehrmacht officers filed a report that said what no propaganda broadcast in Berlin would ever admit. The 26th Panzer Division, which had fought Sherman's first hand in the mountains south of Rome, submitted its assessment. The Sherman climbs mountains our tank experts consider inaccessible to tanks. Its cross-country mobility is definitely superior to that of our tanks. This was not a compliment, it was a confession. The tank that Göring had dismissed as the product of refrigerator makers was outclimbing German armor on terrain that German engineers had declared impassable. And Detroit was only getting started. By the end of 1942, Chrysler had built 5,004 tanks, 4 more than its assigned target. The company then did something that no defense contractor in the 21st century has ever done. It wrote a check for $7,900,000 and mailed it back to the United States government. The tanks had come in cheaper than projected. Chrysler was returning the difference. Over the course of the war, Chrysler would send back roughly $50 million in refunds and price reductions. Its executives, including President K.T. Keller, drew a salary of $5 a year. But what made Detroit's tank production different was not any single factory, it was the ecosystem behind it. Every Sherman tank that rolled off the line was the product of an entire city's worth of automakers working in parallel. Dodge built the suspension components. DeSoto built the gun recoil mechanisms. Ford designed and manufactured the GAAV-8 engine, a 1,100 cubic inch motor originally intended for aircraft, repurposed for armor. Buick built the 76mm M1 gun. Oldsmobile built the 75mm M3 gun. Detroit Diesel built the engines for the M4A2 variant. A C spark plug built the instrument panels. Delco Remy built the starters and generators, Harrison built the radiators. A Sherman tank was not a Chrysler product or a GM product. It was a Detroit product, assembled from the DNA of every major automaker in Michigan, and every part from every factory was interchangeable with every other. A suspension built by Dodge in Detroit could replace one built by Fisher in Grand Blanc without a single modification. Germany never achieved anything close to this. The first Shermans reached combat in North Africa in October 1942, during Operation Torch. The British had already been fighting with the earlier M3 Lee, a tank the Germans had called a dangerous new heavy tank. It could hit them from ranges no British weapon had reached before. The Sherman was a generation beyond the Lee, and it arrived in the thousands. By June 1944, Sherman tanks were pouring onto the beaches of Normandy. 50,000 vehicles of all types crossed those beaches in the first weeks. General Dwight Eisenhower walked the shoreline after the landings, surveying the wreckage, burned-out hulls, shattered treads, bullet-pierced armor scattered across the sand. He later wrote about what he saw. "There was no sight in the war that so impressed me with the industrial might of America as the wreckage on the landing beaches." What impressed Eisenhower was not that America had built superior machines. It was that America had built so many that it could afford to lose thousands and keep fighting without pause. By the war's end, 11 factories across the United States had produced 49,234 Sherman tanks. Chrysler alone built 17,947 Shermans, plus thousands of M3 Lees, M26 Pershings, and experimental models, bringing its total at the Detroit arsenal to 22,207 tanks. That single factory, on its single plot of former Michigan farmland, outproduced the entire Third Reich. Germany built roughly 20,000 tanks of all types during the whole war. Chrysler beat that number by itself. Total American tank production across all types reached approximately 88,000. Germany's total 20,000. It outproduced the entire Reich by a ratio of nearly 5-1. 4 years after Göring announced that Americans were only good at making refrigerators, he admitted that he knew the exact moment the war was lost. It was when American P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin, escorting wave after wave of bombers. Their engines were Packard-built Merlins, manufactured in a converted Detroit automobile plant. But the numbers that buried the Reich came at a price that no production statistic could measure, and the people who paid it were not in Berlin. The Sherman tank that rolled off the Detroit arsenal line was reliable, easy to repair, and built from parts that any field mechanic could swap in under fire. It was also, by the summer of 1944, outgunned by nearly every German tank it faced. American crews called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose slogan was "Lights every time." German crews had their own name. They called it the Tommy Cooker. Lieutenant Colonel William B. Lovelady, commanding an armored battalion in France, described what his men were living through. One of his Shermans turned a corner and came face to face with a Panther. The Sherman fired 3 rounds into the Panther's front armor. All 3 bounced off. The Sherman reversed behind the corner of a building. The Panther fired once, and the round punched through 2 walls of the house and through the Sherman on the other side. Lack of a principal gun with sufficient penetrating ability to knock out the German opponent has cost us more tanks and skilled men to man more tanks than any failure of our crews. That was what it felt like inside a Sherman. But the full picture was more complicated than any single engagement. A study by the Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory examined 30 armor-on-armor engagements and found that the Sherman achieved a kill ratio of 3.6-1 against the Panther. 85% of all targets engaged by tank crews in the war were not enemy tanks. They were fortifications, buildings, infantry, and artillery positions. For those missions, the 75mm gun was more effective than the 76. General George Patton, whose Third Army burned through more Shermans than any other command, answered the critics directly. Since the Third Army became operational, our total tank casualties have amounted to 1,136 tanks. During the same period, we've accounted for 2,287 German tanks. The Sherman broke down less often than the Panther. It could be repaired in hours instead of days. Its parts were interchangeable across factories, across continents. And when one was destroyed, Detroit sent 5 more. The Tiger was a masterpiece that Germany could not keep running. The Sherman was a workhorse that America could not stop building. A driver from the 3rd Armored Division landed at Utah Beach on the 3rd day after D-Day. By the time he was evacuated to England with a severe wound to his left leg, he was on his 3rd Sherman and his 3rd crew. He rarely saw German tanks except as burnt-out wrecks on the roadside. What he saw constantly were the 88mm guns. The damn 88s were pre-positioned on every road and intersection, and the Germans could shoot them like sniper rifles. They'd let you get so close they couldn't miss, and at those distances they'd penetrate anything every time. He survived. Many of the men who climbed into Shermans beside him did not. And back in Detroit, the city that was building the machines was tearing itself apart. Between 1940 and 1943, Detroit's population surged by 500,000, a 1/3 increase in 3 years. Southern whites and black Americans flooded north for factory jobs, competing for the same scarce housing, the same crowded neighborhoods, the same seats on the same buses. In 1942, the federal government built a housing project for black defense workers in a white neighborhood and named it Sojourner Truth. White residents blockaded the entrance. Black families had to be escorted in by armed police. 10 months before the explosion came, Life magazine published a warning that read like a prophecy. Detroit can either blow up Hitler or it can blow up the US. The arsenal of democracy was producing miracles on the assembly line, but the society that powered it was burning from the inside. And in the summer of 1943, both predictions came true at once. On June 20th, 1943, a fight broke out between black and white Detroiters on Belle Isle, the city's largest park, packed with 100,000 people on a 91-degree Sunday. By nightfall, the fight had spread to the mainland. Rumors tore across both sides of the city, mobs formed, police did little to stop it, and in many cases joined in. By the time President Roosevelt sent in federal troops on the evening of June 21st, 34 people were dead. 25 of them were black. 17 had been shot by police. Hundreds were injured. Thousands of man-hours of war production, tanks, guns, engines, vanished. 3 weeks earlier, it had already cracked. At the Packard plant, one of Detroit's major defense manufacturers, 3 black workers were promoted to positions on the assembly line alongside white workers. 25,000 white employees walked off the job. A voice with a southern accent came over the factory loudspeaker. "I'd rather see Hitler and Hirohito win than work next to a nigger." Tank production stopped. Not because of German bombs, not because of material shortages, because the workers building the machines that were supposed to destroy fascism had decided that racial hatred mattered more than defeating it. And then, 12 months after Detroit tore itself apart, the Sherman faced a crisis that no assembly line could fix. On June 6, 1944, thousands of Shermans rolled onto the beaches of Normandy. Within days they met the Panther, Germany's newest medium tank. American intelligence had predicted that Panthers would be rare, produced in limited numbers like the Tiger. The prediction was catastrophically wrong. Panthers arrived not in dozens but in entire divisions, and the standard Sherman, armed with the same 75mm gun that Loveladies' men had watched bounce off armor in France, could not penetrate a Panther's front plate at any combat range. The worst part was that the army had seen this coming and chosen to ignore it. Before the invasion, armored division commanders had been offered an upgraded Sherman mounting a 76mm gun capable of killing a Panther. Most turned it down. They did not want to complicate their ammunition supply with a second caliber. Within weeks of landing, they were requesting it urgently. The bet that the Sherman would never need to fight enemy armor head-to-head in large numbers had been wrong. Normandy proved it on the first day. The men inside the Shermans called it Tiger Terror. The tankers who'd been told their machine was good enough discovered, under fire, that it was not. For the first time in the war, German tank crews had reason for genuine confidence. In a one-on-one duel, A Tiger or Panther could destroy a Sherman before the Sherman's gun could scratch its armor. German doctrine had always bet on quality over quantity. Fewer machines, better engineering, superior crews. In the hedgerows of Normandy, that bet was paying off. If the war was a contest of engineering, Germany was winning. But the war was not a contest of engineering. It was a contest of production. And Detroit had an answer for every Tiger that rolled off a German factory floor. In July 1944, the 76mm Sherman entered combat for the first time during Operation Cobra. It could kill a Panther. Back in Grand Blanc, Fisher Body began producing a vehicle that no German planner had anticipated, the M4A3E2 Jumbo, a Sherman wrapped in armor so thick that its own drivetrain could barely handle the weight. 254 were built between May and July and shipped straight to the front. By November, Fisher started rolling out something heavier still, the M26 Pershing, armed with a 90mm gun that could meet a Tiger on equal terms. And on the ground, Sherman crews stopped waiting for Detroit to save them. Sergeant Curtis Culin of the 2nd Armored Division welded steel teeth cut from German beach obstacles onto the front of his Sherman, turning it into a hedgerow cutting machine. Over 500 sets were built and fitted in the field. Other crews fired white phosphorus rounds at Tigers. The burning chemical blinded the optics, choked the ventilation, and forced German crews to abandon a tank that no American shell could penetrate. In December 1944, Hitler launched his final gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. German Tiger IIs, 67-ton monsters, pushed through the frozen forest, and then they ran out of fuel. The most powerful tanks in the world sat motionless in the snow because Germany could not produce enough gasoline to keep them moving. Meanwhile, one of the first Allied tanks to break through to the besieged paratroopers at Bastogne was a jumbo Sherman, an M4A3E2 nicknamed Cobra King. It had been built at the Fisher Grand Blanc plant by workers who had been assembling Chevrolets 3 years earlier. Germany had built the finest tank in the world and could not feed it. Detroit had built a good enough tank and could not stop making them. For every Sherman lost, Detroit sent 5 replacements faster than Germany could repair one Tiger. William Knudsen, the Danish immigrant who had given up everything to run America's war production, described what had happened in a single sentence. "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen, nor dreamed possible." When the war ended, Sherman tanks built in Detroit were sitting in the rubble of Berlin, parked along the Rhine, scattered across the deserts of North Africa, rusting on the beaches of Pacific Islands, and still in service with the Red Army on the outskirts of Manchuria. They had been built in 11 factories, shipped across 2 oceans, and fought on every front where the Western Allies set foot. No single weapon had traveled farther from its assembly line. William Knudsen came home from the war a 3-star general and a national hero. He had spent 5 years running the largest industrial mobilization in history, earned 3 stars on his uniform, and come home expecting the only reward he wanted, his old life back. He asked Alfred Sloan, the chairman of GM, the same man who had warned him in 1940, "They'll make a monkey out of you down there in Washington." Sloan turned him down. The reason he gave was age. Knudsen was 65, Sloan was 70. The arsenal of democracy had won the war, but it had been built on a society fractured by the same hatreds it was fighting overseas. The riots that tore Detroit apart in 1943 did not stop a single tank from reaching the front. The Packard strike shut down production so that white workers would not have to stand next to black ones. The tanks that liberated Europe were assembled by women and black Americans who were denied equal housing in the city where they built them. The war forced a question that America had spent its entire history avoiding: who is allowed to contribute? The answer began to change, slowly, painfully, incompletely. But it began on those assembly lines. At the Nuremberg trials, Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, who had spent the final years of the war trying to copy Henry Ford's production methods to save the Reich, was asked what went wrong. He did not blame the bombing or the Allied armies. It was merely due to a few fundamental shortcomings of organization, such as are typical in a dictatorship because of the absence of criticism, that he did not have twice as many tanks, aircraft and submarines before 1942. The dictatorship that had looked so efficient could not match the messy, loud, strike-plagued democracy that argued with itself every step of the way. Germany built the superior tank, America built the superior system, and in a war of systems the better tank lost. Because war is not a design competition, it is a production competition. In 1940, Hermann Göring said Americans were only good at making fancy cars. He was half right. Americans were good at making cars. What Göring did not understand was that when you know how to mass-produce an automobile, you know how to mass-produce anything, including 86,000 tanks. And Keller, the man who had never seen a tank in 1940, ended up building more of them than all of Germany. His salary for the job was $5 a year.